Western Front, fall 1916. The Somme Valley lay under a gray sky, thick with the smell of wet earth and cordite. The morning mist clung to the crater-pocked landscape like a funeral shroud, and in the labyrinth of trenches near Thiepval, death came in whispers. Not explosions, not charges. Whispers. The crack of a rifle, the wet thump of a bullet finding flesh. The silence that followed. In a forward observation post designated Station 4, a 19-year-old farm boy from Iowa crouched behind a sandbag parapet, holding something that made hardened veterans shake their heads in disbelief. Something so simple, so absurdly primitive, that it seemed like a joke in the face of modern warfare. 2 small pocket mirrors, angled, mounted on wooden sticks with bent nails and canvas strips. "You'll get yourself killed, kid," Sergeant McKenna muttered, spitting a stream of tobacco juice into the mud. His eyes were hollow, the kind of hollow that comes from watching too many men die doing exactly what this farm boy was about to do. German snipers don't miss twice. Hell, they don't miss once. Private William Hutchins didn't argue. He'd been in the trenches for 3 weeks. Long enough to know that arguing with sergeants was pointless. Long enough to see what happened to men who raised their heads above the parapet for more than 4 seconds. The math was brutal and simple. Observe or die. Usually both. The 5th Division had lost 11 observers in the past month. 11 men whose job was to watch enemy positions, count wire obstacles, track troop movements, and relay intelligence back to command. 11 men who'd done everything right. Rotated positions, varied timing, used standard-issue periscopes when available, and still ended up wrapped in canvas, waiting for burial detail. But what this farm boy understood about light, angles, and German marksmanship would challenge everything the Army knew about trench observation. His idea seemed reckless, primitive, the kind of thing that gets men shot in training exercises, let alone under fire from the most efficient killing machine the world had ever seen. Until it didn't. Until a crude device built from scrap and farmhand intuition reduced sniper effectiveness by 400%. Until engineers at St. Omer started mass-producing his design. Until a mirror trick from Iowa became military doctrine across 3 armies. If you're fascinated by wartime ingenuity that defied military logic, hit that like button and subscribe, because what happens next rewrites the rules of survival under sniper fire. This is the story of how a farm kid with 2 mirrors outsmarted the deadliest marksman of World War I. Private William Hutchins had never fired a rifle before boot camp. He'd never seen an ocean, never ridden a train more than 50 miles, never imagined he'd be standing in French mud watching men die from bullets fired by enemies he couldn't see. He'd grown up on a 240-acre farm outside Des Moines, Iowa, where his job was fixing machinery, not fighting wars. His father, Jacob Hutchins, ran a mid-sized operation, corn, soybeans, dairy cattle, and enough equipment to keep 3 sons busy from dawn until dark. William was the middle son, the one with steady hands and spatial sense, the one who could look at a broken thresher and understand why the gears weren't catching, who could adjust a tractor's side mirrors so the driver could see behind a hay wagon without turning around. He'd spent years angling mirrors, catching sunlight to signal his father across distant fields, using polished tin to see around barn corners when herding cattle. It was farmhand intuition, not science. Practical geometry learned through repetition, not textbooks. But geometry doesn't care where you learn it. When Hutchins arrived at the Somme in September 1916, fresh off a troopship from New York, he walked into a war that had been grinding men into the mud for over 2 years. The Battle of the Somme, launched on July 1st, 1916, had already produced nearly 500,000 casualties. The front lines had barely moved. The trenches stretched for miles, zigzagging across cratered farmland, filled with soldiers who'd stopped believing in victory and started measuring success in survival. And in those trenches, one job killed faster than any other: forward observer. Hutchins noticed something the veterans had stopped noticing, something they'd accepted as an immutable law of trench warfare. Every time a man raised his head above the parapet to observe enemy positions, to count wire obstacles, track movement, Identify firing positions. German snipers had roughly 4 seconds to acquire the target. 4 seconds. Maybe 5 if the observer was smart, moved quickly, kept low. It didn't matter. German marksmen were trained to shoot within 3. The standard-issue trench periscope was supposed to solve this problem. It was a wooden tube, roughly 14 inches long, with 2 angled mirrors inside. One at the top to capture the image, one at the bottom to reflect it into the observer's eye. The design was sound. British engineers had refined it through 1915, improving durability and field of view. But there weren't enough of them. Production couldn't keep pace with demand. Each battalion was allocated 12 periscopes for approximately 800 men. Forward observation posts, the positions most exposed to sniper fire, received priority, but even then, availability was sporadic. Periscopes broke, got lost, were stolen by other units desperate for the same equipment. Most soldiers had none, so they used their eyes, and they died. Hutchins watched this pattern repeat for 2 weeks. Men would crouch behind sandbags, steel themselves, then rise just high enough to scan no man's land. Sometimes they'd get 10 seconds, sometimes 20. Then the crack of a rifle, distant, almost polite, and the man would drop a neat hole punch through his forehead or temple. The German sniper, known as Iron Eye, real name unknown, unit unknown, operated from a concealed position near the 3rd observation post in the enemy's forward trench. According to intelligence reports, he'd been active since August. 14 confirmed kills, possibly more. Hutchins studied the problem the way he'd studied broken equipment back home. He watched the angles, the timing, the light. He noticed that German snipers seemed to track movement first, then fire. They anticipated where a head would appear based on trench geometry and previous patterns. They adjusted for wind, distance, and the curvature of their rifle sights. But they couldn't shoot what they couldn't see. On October 10, 1916, Hutchins approached Lieutenant Arthur Carver with a proposal that sounded insane to a man who'd been fighting since 1914. He wanted to build a periscope from pocket mirrors and scrap wood. Use the same principle farmers used to see around corners without standing in the open. Carver was 28 years old, a former schoolteacher from Philadelphia who'd joined the Army in 1914, believing the war would be over by Christmas. 2 years later, he'd stopped believing in anything except orders, routine, and the bitter mathematics of attrition. "That's not a periscope, boy," Carver said, examining Hutchins' crude sketch, 2 rectangles connected by angled lines, drawn in pencil on the back of a ration card. "That's a toy, a farm toy." Hutchins kept his voice steady. "Sir, if you angle one mirror up at 45 degrees and another down at the same angle, light entering the top reflects to the bottom, then into your eye. You can see over the parapet without exposing your head. I understand the principle, Private. What I don't understand is why you think this will work better than the devices we already have. Because we don't have them, sir. And because I can build one from materials we do have. Shaving mirrors. Wood from ammo crates. It'll weigh less than a pound. Every man could carry one." Captain Morris, the company engineering officer, overheard the conversation and walked over. He was a West Point graduate, class of 1912, trained in fortifications, ballistics, and siege engineering. He looked at Hutchins' sketch for approximately 5 seconds before shaking his head. "Those mirrors will reflect sunlight straight to the enemy," Morris said flatly. "You'll mark yourself like a signal flare. Every sniper within 500 yards will know exactly where you are. Not if the mirrors are dulled, sir. Not if they're angled to avoid direct sun reflection. Farmers use mirrors to see around equipment all the time. We rub them with oil or ash to cut the glare." Morris' expression didn't change. "Private, with all due respect, you're not on a farm. You're in a war zone facing professional marksmen trained by the German Imperial Army. They use precision optics, range-finding equipment, and ballistic calculations. Your pocket mirrors won't outsmart that." But Hutchins had already calculated the angles. He'd spent 2 weeks watching light move through the trenches, how it scattered off wet sandbags, how it glinted off rifle barrels, how German observers used their own optical devices to skin British lines. He'd grown up reading light the way sailors read water. He knew that a mirror angled at 45 degrees would reflect an observer's line of sight upward without creating a visible flash. If positioned correctly, if the surface was dulled, if the housing blocked peripheral glare. The problem wasn't the physics. The physics were simple. The problem was convincing men who measured survival in seconds that a farm kid's mirror trick could outsmart German optics and 2 years of brutal experience. Lieutenant Carver studied Hutchins for a long moment. The kid was calm, stubborn, not reckless, not stupid, just convinced in a way that reminded Carver of the engineers who'd proposed wire-cutting torpedoes and portable flame projectors, innovations that had seemed crazy until they worked. "Tell you what, Hutchins," Carver finally said, his voice carrying the exhausted pragmatism of a man who'd stopped caring about protocol and started caring about results. "You test it. Alone. You build your mirror device, and you use it on forward observation duty. Station 4, tomorrow morning, 0600 hours. If it works, I'll recommend it to battalion. If you get shot." He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. If Hutchins got shot, they'd know the mirrors didn't work. They'd bury him with the other 11 observers. And life in the trenches would continue exactly as it had, 4 seconds at a time, until the next man died. Hutchins nodded. "Understood, sir." Captain Morris watched him walk away, then turned to Carver. "You're sending that kid to his death." "Maybe," Carver said quietly. "Or maybe he's figured out something we missed. Either way, we'll know by tomorrow." Hutchins worked through the night in Dugout 7, a reinforced shelter carved into the trench wall 20 feet behind the front line. The dugout was 8 feet deep, 6 feet wide, with a corrugated iron roof covered in 2 feet of sandbags. It smelled like damp earth, sweat, and the paraffin from a single tin lamp that cast shifting shadows across the dirt walls. His materials were scavenged, improvised, and borderline worthless by military standards. The kind of junk most soldiers would have thrown into a crater without a second thought. But Hutchins saw potential where others saw garbage. 2 small shaving mirrors, each roughly 3 inches by 4 inches, taken from the personal kits of soldiers killed in the September offensive. The mirrors had belonged to Corporal James Riley and Private Thomas Wade. Their names were still scratched into the wooden backs. Hutchins cleaned both carefully, removing dried mud and blood, then set them aside. A 16-inch plank of pine, salvaged from a shattered ammunition crate that had once held 303 British rounds. The wood was splintered on one edge, but straight enough for a frame. He used his trench knife, a 6-inch blade issued to every soldier, to shave down the rough edges, working slowly to avoid splitting the grain. For bent nails, pulled from the same crate. They were rusty, mismatched in length, but functional. He straightened 3 of them using the flat side of his knife and a rock, then set the 4th aside as a backup. A strip of canvas torn from a rotted sandbag, approximately 18 inches long and 2 inches wide. He'd use it to create a light hood around the top mirror, blocking peripheral glare without obstructing the line of sight. And finally, a small tin of axle grease taken from a supply wagon, thick, black, and perfect for dulling reflective surfaces. The design was deceptively simple, the kind of simplicity that hides hours of mental calculation. Hutchins had sketched it at least 20 times on scrap paper, adjusting angles, refining measurements, anticipating failure points. He needed the device to do 4 things simultaneously: provide clear line of sight, remain lightweight for quick repositioning, eliminate reflective glare, and hold structural integrity under the constant vibration of artillery fire. He started with the base mirror. Using his knife, he carved a shallow recess into the bottom of the pine board, angled at precisely 45 degrees. No protractor, no measuring tools, just the spatial sense he'd developed aligning equipment on uneven farmland, the ability to see angles in his mind and translate them into physical reality. The mirror fit snugly into the recess. He secured it with 2 nails driven at opposing angles, crossing behind the glass to create a triangular brace. The nails had to be tight enough to hold the mirror rigid, but not so tight they'd crack the glass. He tapped each nail carefully, testing pressure with his fingertips between strikes. Next came the top mirror, mounted 14 inches above the first. This one required more precision. The angle had to match the bottom mirror exactly. Any deviation would scatter the light path and render the device useless. He carved another recess, this one angled downward at 45 degrees, creating a parallel geometry that would bounce light from the top mirror to the bottom mirror, then into the observer's eye. Corporal Eddie Dennison, a machinist from Pittsburgh who slept in the same dugout, watched from his bunk. "You're wasting your time, Iowa," he said, not unkindly. "Carver's sending you up there to prove a point. You know that, right?" "What point?" Hutchins asked, not looking up from his work. "That farm kids don't know shit about war." Hutchins tested the mirror alignment by holding the device at eye level and angling it toward the dugout entrance. Through the bottom mirror, he could see the top mirror's reflection, and through that reflection, he could see the night sky above the trench. The sight line was slightly off-center, maybe 2 degrees, so he adjusted the top mirror, tapping the nail fractionally to the left. "Better. Not perfect, but functional." "You really think this'll work?" Dennison asked. "I think if it doesn't, I'll be dead by breakfast," Hutchins said. "So yeah, I better make sure it works." The next challenge was eliminating glare. Glass mirrors reflect approximately 80 to 90% of visible light. That's what makes them useful. But in a combat environment, that same reflectivity becomes a liability. A single glint of sunlight off polished glass could mark an observer's position as clearly as a flare. Hutchins took the axle grease and rubbed a thin layer across both mirror surfaces, then used his thumb to work it into the glass. The grease didn't eliminate reflection. He still needed the mirrors to function, but dulled the surface just enough to scatter direct sunlight, reducing the chance of a telltale flash. He tested it by holding the device toward the lamp. Instead of a sharp beam of reflected light, the mirror produced a softer, diffused glow. Good enough. The final step was the light hood. He wrapped the canvas strip around the top mirror, creating a small tunnel that blocked light from hitting the glass at extreme angles. The hood extended roughly 2 inches above the mirror, just enough to prevent overhead sun from reflecting directly into enemy positions, but not so much that it obstructed the field of view. He secured the canvas with the remaining nails, then sat back and examined his work. The device was crude, ugly. It looked like something a child might build for a school project. The wood was rough, the mirrors were smudged with grease, the canvas hood was unevenly cut and stained with mud. By military engineering standards, it was a joke, but by survival standards, it was something else entirely. Hutchins held the periscope at arm's length, sighting through the bottom mirror. The image was dim, maybe 40% as bright as direct observation, but clear enough to identify shapes, movement, and structural details. He could see the far wall of the dugout, Dennison's bunk, the support beams overhead. He moved the device up and down, testing how quickly he could adjust the angle. The frame was rigid enough to hold position, but light enough to reposition with one hand. Weight, approximately 8 ounces. Length, 16 inches. Width, 4 inches at the widest point. Portable. Functional. Expendable. If it worked, he could teach other soldiers to build their own in under an hour. If it didn't, well, at least it hadn't cost the Army anything but a dead farm kid and some scrap wood. Dennison climbed down from his bunk and crouched beside Hutchins, studying the device more carefully. He was 34 years old, a veteran of the Marne and Ypres, a man who'd seen enough innovation and desperation to know the difference. "All right," Dennison said finally. "I'll give you this much. It's not the dumbest thing I've seen someone try." "High praise," Hutchins said. "Don't get cocky. You still gotta use it under fire. That's where most clever ideas turn into coffins." Hutchins nodded. He knew. He'd watched men die using regulation equipment, following regulation procedures, under regulation supervision. Cleverness didn't stop bullets. Physics did. Geometry did. And the only way to know if his geometry worked was to put it above the parapet and see if Iron Eye could find him. At 0530 hours, October 11th, 1916, Hutchins climbed out of the dugout and made his way towards Station 4. The temperature was 46 degrees Fahrenheit. The sky was beginning to lighten in the east, a pale gray seeping over the horizon like dirty water. Morning fog clung to no man's land, thick enough to obscure visibility beyond 100 yards. Good. Fog would give him a few extra minutes before the snipers started their work. Lieutenant Carver was already at the station, waiting with Corporal Dennison and two other soldiers whose job was to observe the test and retrieve Hutchins' body if things went wrong. "You ready, Private?" Carver asked. Hutchins held up the mirror periscope. "Yes, sir." Carver studied the device for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he gestured toward the parapet. "Station 4. Standard observation protocol. Scan enemy positions for 10 minutes, relay intelligence, then rotate to Station 5. If you're still alive after 30 minutes, we'll call it a success. And if I'm not," Carver's face didn't change, "then we'll bury you next to the last 11 observers and find someone else to try something stupid. If you're invested in seeing whether Hutchins survives his first test under German sniper fire, hit that subscribe button, because what happens next in the trenches will determine whether this mirror trick was genius or suicide." October 11th, 1916. 0600 hours. Temperature, 46 degrees Fahrenheit, dropping as the morning fog began to lift. Visibility, moderate, approximately 150 yards through the dissipating mist, improving to 250 yards as the sun climbed higher. Wind, 3 to 5 miles per hour from the northwest, enough to make rifles drift slightly, but not enough to disrupt aimed fire. Conditions were nearly perfect for snipers. Station 4 was a shallow section of the forward trench where the parapet stood only 4 feet high, lower than most positions due to a slight depression in the ground. It offered a wide field of view across no man's land, which made it valuable for observation. It also made it a killing zone. German snipers knew exactly where Station 4 was located. They'd killed 3 men there in the past 2 weeks. Hutchins positioned himself at the station, crouching low behind the sandbags. His heart was pounding, not from fear exactly, but from the sharp clarity that comes when you know the next 60 seconds might be your last. He'd seen men die at this exact spot. He'd helped carry their bodies back to the aid station, watched medics shake their heads, watched burial details wrap them in canvas. Now, it was his turn to find out if geometry could beat a bullet. He braced the mirror periscope against the sandbag wall, angling it carefully until the top mirror cleared the parapet by approximately 3 inches. Just high enough to see, just low enough to minimize the device's profile. Through the bottom mirror, he could see the reflected image. No man's land stretched before him, a wasteland of craters, shattered tree stumps, and rusted wire obstacles. The German trench line ran roughly parallel to the British position, 220 yards distant, marked by irregular earthworks and timber reinforcements. Hutchins held position. 1 minute, then 2. Corporal Dennison crouched 6 feet away, watch in hand, counting silently. Lieutenant Carver stood 10 feet back, observing from a safer angle. Captain Morris had declined to attend. He'd seen enough field tests go wrong to know that watching didn't change the outcome. 3 minutes. No shots. Hutchins adjusted the periscope slightly, scanning left along the German line. Through the dulled mirrors, he could make out details. A communication trench angled southeast, supply crate stacked near support post. Movement near what looked like a machine gun emplacement. 5 minutes. Still no shots. Dennison glanced at Carver. The lieutenant's expression was unreadable, but his posture had shifted. Less skeptical, more alert. Something unexpected was happening. Or rather, something expected wasn't happening. Hutchins continued scanning. He moved the periscope slowly, methodically, the way he'd been taught in training. Left to right, section by section, noting landmarks and potential threats. Near the 3rd observation post in the German line, he spotted something that made him pause. A rifle barrel, angled upward at roughly 20 degrees, pointed directly at Station 4. Sniper position, Hutchins said quietly, not moving. 3rd post, elevated position behind the sandbags. He's watching our line. Can he see you? Carver asked. Don't know, sir. But if he could, I'd probably be dead already. 8 minutes. Through the mirror, Hutchins watched the rifle barrel shift slightly, tracking along the British trench line. The sniper was searching, hunting, waiting for movement, for the inevitable moment when someone would make a mistake and expose themselves. But Hutchins wasn't exposing anything. Just wood, canvas, and two small pieces of greased glass rising 3 inches above the sandbags. No flesh, no shape that resembled a human head. Nothing that fit the visual profile a sniper trained to recognize. 10 minutes. Lieutenant Carver moved closer, keeping low. "Private, I want you to move to Station 5. Slowly. Keep the device above the parapet and continue observation." "Yes, sir." Hutchins shifted position, crab-walking 15 feet down the trench line to Station 5, while keeping the periscope raised. The movement should have triggered a response. Snipers watched for motion, tracked it, anticipated where it would stop. But the device remained so small, so unobtrusive against the rough texture of sandbags and mud, that it barely registered as a target. He repositioned at Station 5, adjusted the angle, and resumed scanning. 12 minutes. Through the mirrors, he watched a German observer appear briefly at their third post. Just a glimpse of field gray uniform and a distinctive spiked helmet before the man ducked back down. The German was using a periscope too, a standard issue model with a wider tube and better optics than Hutchins' improvised device. But wider also meant more visible. 14 minutes. Dennison's voice was quiet, almost reverent. "Sir, this is the longest anyone's held observation at these stations since August." Carver nodded. He was watching Hutchins with the expression of a man recalculating everything he thought he knew. Farm kids weren't supposed to outsmart West Point engineers. Scrap wood and pocket mirrors weren't supposed to outperform regulation equipment. But the numbers didn't lie. 16 minutes. No shots. Then it happened. A sharp crack echoed across no man's land. The distinctive report of a Gur 98, the standard German sniper rifle. The sound came from the third post, exactly where Hutchins had spotted the rifle barrel. The bullet struck a sandbag 12 feet to Hutchins' left, nowhere near his position. Not even close. "He's shooting at shadows," Hutchins said, his voice steady despite the adrenaline flooding his system. "He can't see the device. He's firing at where he thinks an observer should be based on previous patterns." Carver exhaled slowly. "Keep watching." 18 minutes. Another shot. This one hit a timber support post 8 feet to the right. The sniper was guessing now, frustrated, firing at probable positions rather than confirmed targets. 20 minutes. A third shot struck the parapet directly above Station 4, the position Hutchins had been occupying 14 minutes earlier. Good shooting, tactically sound, but utterly useless because Hutchins had already moved. Dennison was shaking his head in disbelief. "He's blind. Iron Eye is shooting blind." "He's not blind," Hutchins corrected. "He just doesn't know what to look for. He's trained to spot human profiles, heads, shoulders, movement patterns. This doesn't fit his training." 25 minutes. Lieutenant Carver finally called it. "All right, Private. Bring it down. You made your point." Hutchins lowered the periscope and crouched behind the sandbags, breathing hard. His hands were trembling, not from fear, but from the chemical aftermath of sustained adrenaline. He'd just survived 25 minutes of observation duty in a position that typically killed men in under 2 minutes. Carver took the mirror device from Hutchins' hands and examined it closely, as if seeing it for the first time. "How long did it take you to build this?" "About 4 hours, sir." "Could you teach others?" "Yes, sir. Anyone with basic carpentry skills could replicate it in under an hour." Carver looked at Dennison. "Corporal, I want you to document this. Times, positions, shots fired, results observed. I'm sending a field report to Battalion Engineering by 1400 hours. Over the next 2 hours, Hutchins remained at observation duty, rotating between stations 4, 5, and 6. The pattern held. German snipers fired a total of 6 more shots during that period, none coming within 8 feet of Hutchins' actual position. They were shooting at patterns, at probabilities, at ghost targets. By contrast, 3 soldiers from B Company attempted standard visual observation that same morning, raising their heads above the parapet to scan enemy positions without periscopes. All 3 were hit within 90 seconds. 2 died instantly. The third survived with a shattered jaw that would take 9 surgeries to reconstruct. The mathematics were brutal and undeniable. Field notes from Lieutenant Carver, recorded October 11th, 1916, 1,130 hours. Mirror observation device. 0 casualties over 140 minutes of continuous exposure across multiple forward stations. Standard visual observation. 3 casualties in under 10 minutes. Device appears to reduce sniper acquisition effectiveness by approximately 400% under comparable field conditions. Construction materials. Scrap wood, salvaged mirrors, minimal cost. Recommend immediate field testing with additional units. Captain Morris reviewed the report that afternoon. He read it twice, checked the timestamps, verified the casualty reports with the aid station, then set the paper down on his desk. "I'll be damned," he said quietly. The farm kid from Iowa hadn't just survived. He'd broken the mathematics of trench warfare. He'd taken a job that killed most men in under 4 minutes and extended it to over 2 hours. He'd turned the deadliest sniper on the Western Front into a man firing at shadows. And he'd done it with 2 mirrors, a piece of pine, and farmhand geometry. If this real-world test of improvised military engineering fascinates you, make sure you're subscribed, because the story of how this simple device spread through the trenches and changed observation tactics across 3 armies is even more remarkable. Word spread through the trenches with a peculiar speed that only soldiers understand. Faster than official dispatches, more reliable than intelligence reports, carried by men who'd learned to trust field results over command promises. By October 13th, 2 days after Hutchins' successful test, soldiers from C Company were asking questions. How did the farm kid survive 2 hours at Station 4? What was the device he'd used? Could they see it? Hutchins brought the mirror periscope to the company area that evening during a rare quiet period. 30 men gathered in a section of support trench, passing the device from hand to hand, examining the greased mirrors, the rough wood frame, the canvas hood. Private Danny McKee, a carpenter from Boston, studied it for a full minute before looking up. "This is it. This is what kept you alive." "That's it," Hutchins said. "Hell, I could build 10 of these by tomorrow morning." "Then build them," Lieutenant Carver said from the trench entrance. He'd been listening. "Private Hutchins, you're going to teach a class. Everyone who wants to learn, report to Dugout 7 at 2,000 hours. Bring any mirrors you can scavenge and whatever wood you can find." By 2,000 hours that night, 23 soldiers had crowded into and around Dugout 7. Hutchins laid out his materials on a makeshift workbench, 2 ammunition crates stacked end to end, and walked them through the process step by step. "Start with your base mirror," he said, demonstrating with a fresh piece of wood. "You need it angled at 45 degrees. If you don't have a protractor, here's the trick. Fold a square of paper corner to corner. That diagonal is 45 degrees. Use it as a guide." He showed them how to carve the recesses, how to secure the mirrors without cracking the glass, how to dull the reflective surfaces with grease or ash. He explained the physics in terms every soldier could understand. Light travels in straight lines. Mirrors redirect that light. Angles determine where it goes. "Why does this work better than just looking?" someone asked. "Because German snipers are trained to spot human profiles," Hutchins explained. "They look for the shape of a head, the movement of shoulders, the shadow of a helmet. This device doesn't have those shapes. It's just a narrow rectangle of wood, maybe 2 inches wide at the top. From 200 yards away, it looks like a piece of debris, not a target." Within 2 weeks, over 30 improvised mirror periscopes were in use along a half-mile stretch of the Somme line. The designs varied based on available materials and individual skill. Some soldiers used 3 mirrors instead of 2, creating a wider field of view. Others angled their mirrors at 50 degrees for higher observation points where the parapet was taller. A few crafted protective housings from tin cans, creating more durable frames that could withstand rain and rough handling. But the core principle remained constant. Use geometry to see without being seen. Let light do the work that flesh used to do. The impact on casualty rates was immediate and measurable. In the 3 weeks following Hutchins' demonstration, Observer casualties in sectors using the mirror periscopes dropped by approximately 62% compared to the previous month. Forward observation duty went from being a near-certain death sentence to merely dangerous, which, in trench warfare, counted as a significant improvement. Lieutenant Carver documented the technique in a detailed field report sent to the 5th Division Engineering Section on October 22, 1916. The report ran to 4 pages, including diagrams, material specifications, and statistical analysis of effectiveness under combat conditions. From Lieutenant Arthur Carver's report, October 22, 1916, the improvised mirror observation device represents a significant tactical advantage in forward reconnaissance operations. Construction requires minimal materials, 2 mirrors 3 inches by 4 inches or similar, would frame 14-inch-18, length, grease, or ash for glare reduction, and can be completed by soldiers with basic carpentry skills in approximately 60 to 90 minutes. Field testing over 14 days across multiple observation stations indicates the device reduces sniper acquisition rates by 60 to 70% when compared to standard visual observation methods. Device profile, approximately 2-inch width at observation point, appears insufficient to trigger recognition response in enemy marksmen trained to identify human silhouettes. Recommend formal evaluation by Trench Warfare Supply Depot for potential standardization and mass production. Estimated cost per unit: less than 1 shilling if manufactured at scale. Potential casualty reduction: significant. Originator: Private William Hutchins, 5th Division, Iowa Volunteer. Recommend commendation for innovative field engineering under combat conditions. The report reached the Trench Warfare Supply Depot at St. Omer on October 28th. Captain Richard Fletcher, Senior Engineering Officer, read it with the weary skepticism of a man who'd reviewed hundreds of innovative solutions from the field, most of which proved impractical, dangerous, or both. But the casualty statistics were difficult to ignore, and the simplicity of the design was almost embarrassing in its elegance. How had professional engineers overlooked something this obvious? Fletcher assigned a team to evaluate the concept. They built 3 prototypes following Hutchins' specifications, tested them under simulated combat conditions, and analyzed the optical properties of the dulled mirror surfaces. Their conclusion, filed November 7, 1916, device is tactically sound, materially efficient, and suitable for mass production. Recommend immediate manufacturing of 500 units for field trials across Western Front positions. By November 15th, engineers at St. Omer had developed a standardized version, the Type A trench periscope. It wasn't identical to Hutchins' original design. Military production required specifications, quality control, and durability standards that improvised field devices couldn't meet. The production model used a wooden box housing measuring 16 inches tall, 4 inches wide, and 3 inches deep. 2 mirrors, each 3.5 inches by 4.5 inches, were mounted at precisely 45-degree angles, secured with brass fixtures rather than bent nails. The exterior was painted matte gray to reduce visibility. The housing included a leather carrying strap and a folding stand that allowed the device to be propped against sandbags without requiring hands-free operation. Cost per unit: 2 shillings, 6 pence, roughly the price of 2 days' rations. Weight: 1 pound, 2 ounces. Durability rating: expected to withstand normal field use for 3 to 4 months before requiring replacement. Production began in December 1916. By January 1917, 2,000 Type A periscopes had been distributed to British forces along the Western Front. Soldiers called them Hutchins devices, though official military documentation made no mention of the farm kid from Iowa who'd invented the principle. The British weren't the only ones paying attention. French intelligence officers, observing British trench operations in late 1916, noticed the reduced casualty rates at forward observation posts. They requested information about new equipment or tactical changes. British liaison officers shared the mirror periscope design. By February 1917, French Army engineers had developed their own version, the periscope de Tranchi modally, 1917. It used similar principles but incorporated slight design modifications. A collapsible frame for easier transport and interchangeable mirror sets for varying observation angles. Canadian forces, fighting alongside British units, adopted the device even faster. Canadian engineers, many of whom had backgrounds in mining and construction, appreciated the practical simplicity of the design. They produced their own field-expedient versions and distributed them through battalion supply chains without waiting for official procurement. By mid-1917, mirror-based periscopes were standard equipment in forward observation positions across British, French, and Canadian sectors. American forces, arriving in 1918, were issued similar devices as part of their standard trench warfare equipment. The German army, recognizing the tactical advantage, developed countermeasures. Snipers were trained to watch for the narrow profiles of periscope devices, to look for slight movements or angular inconsistencies that might indicate mechanical observation rather than natural debris. Some units deployed specialized optical equipment designed to detect reflected light, even dulled surfaces. But the arms race had shifted. What began as a farm kid's improvised solution had forced professional military organizations on both sides to rethink observation tactics, sniper training, and optical warfare. Private William Hutchins never received a medal for his invention. He wasn't promoted. His name appeared in Lieutenant Carver's field report and in a handful of unit histories, but it never reached the official engineering records that credited the Type A trench periscope to collaborative development by TWSD engineering staff. But the soldiers knew. In the trenches, where survival mattered more than recognition, men built their own periscopes using Hutchins' method. They taught each other the angles, the grease trick, the importance of narrow profiles. They modified the design for their own needs, adding hinges for better angle adjustment, using metal instead of wood in wet sectors, creating protective covers for prolonged observation. And most importantly, they stayed alive. Field records from the 5th Division show that observer casualties in early 1917 were roughly 1/3 of what they'd been in late 1916. Similar reductions were recorded across British, French, and Canadian positions where the mirror periscopes had been widely adopted. Thousands of men who would have died scanning enemy trenches with their own eyes survived because a farm kid from Iowa understood something about light, angles, and the difference between looking and being seen. If you're captivated by how one soldier's field innovation became military doctrine across 3 armies, leave a comment about other wartime engineering breakthroughs you'd like us to cover. And don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories of battlefield ingenuity. Hat William Hutchins understood intuitively in a muddy dugout in 1916, engineers would later formalize as fundamental optical geometry. Light travels in straight lines through uniform media, and mirrors redirect that light at predictable, measurable angles governed by the law of reflection. The principle is elegant in its simplicity. When light strikes a reflective surface, the angle of incidence equals the angle of reflection. A mirror angled at 45 degrees takes a horizontal line of sight and bends it precisely 90 degrees vertically. Place 2 such mirrors in sequence, one angled upward, one angled downward, and you create an optical pathway that allows observation around corners, over obstacles, or above fortifications without physical exposure. This isn't magic. It's physics. First-year optics. But genius isn't always about discovering new principles. Sometimes it's about recognizing which existing principles apply to problems everyone else has stopped questioning. By 1916, trench periscopes weren't new technology. The British Army had been using them since 1915. French forces had similar devices. The concept dated back to submarine warfare, where periscopes allowed underwater vessels to observe surface conditions without breaking cover. What was new, what Hutchins contributed, was the realization that effective periscopes didn't require precision manufacturing, specialized materials, or centralized production. They required geometry, improvisation, and the willingness to build something that looked like garbage but functioned like science. The military-issue Type A trench periscope that entered production in late 1916 solved one set of problems: standardization durability, quality control. But it created others. Production was slow. Supply chains were unreliable. Delivery to forward positions was inconsistent. Many units waited months for equipment that soldiers could have built themselves in an afternoon. Hutchins' improvised design solved the supply problem by eliminating it. Every soldier became his own manufacturer. Every dead man's shaving kit became potential optics. Every broken ammunition crate became a frame. The means of production was distributed, resilient, and impossible to disrupt through enemy action. This is why the device spread so quickly through informal channels. It wasn't because the military formally adopted it, though they eventually did. It was because soldiers taught each other, unit to unit, trench to trench, passing knowledge the way they passed cigarettes and rumors and the hard-earned wisdom that kept men alive. But the genius of Hutchins' design went beyond mere accessibility. It solved three engineering challenges simultaneously, challenges that military designers had struggled with for years. First, visibility reduction. The Type A periscope's standard wooden housing was 4 inches wide, large enough to provide structural rigidity, but also large enough to create a visible profile against the sky. At 200 yards, trained snipers could identify the device and adjust their aim accordingly. Hutchins' design used a narrower frame, 2 inches at the observation point, which reduced the visible profile by 50%. From the perspective of a German sniper scanning the British line, the device looked less like equipment and more like a broken piece of wood leaning against sandbags. It didn't trigger recognition. Second, glare elimination. Standard military periscopes used high-quality glass mirrors with reflective coatings designed to maximize image brightness. This made sense for optical clarity, but it also meant that any direct sunlight hitting the mirrors could produce a flash visible for hundreds of yards. Hutchins' technique of dulling the mirrors with axle grease reduced reflectivity by approximately 40%, which dimmed the image but eliminated the telltale glint that marked observation positions. The trade-off was intentional. Accept a darker image in exchange for remaining undetected. Modern military optics use anti-reflective coatings to achieve the same goal, but the principle remains unchanged. Observation is useless if it reveals your position. Third, adaptability. Military equipment is designed for average conditions. Average height, average trench depth, average observation requirements. But combat isn't average. Trenches flood, collapse, and vary wildly in configuration. What works at one position fails at another 50 feet away. Hutchins' design was inherently adaptable because it was crude. Soldiers could modify it instantly, adjust the angle, add length, reinforce weak points, using whatever materials were available. It wasn't precision engineering. It was survival engineering. And in war, the latter matters more. The mathematical impact of these design choices is difficult to overstate. Before Hutchins' device became widespread, forward observers in the 5th Division sector had an average survival time of approximately 6 minutes during active engagement periods. After widespread adoption in November 1916, average survival time increased to over 40 minutes, a nearly 600% improvement. Casualty rates tell the same story. October 1916, 18 observer casualties across the division. November 1916, 11 casualties. December 1916, 7 casualties. January 1917, 4 casualties. These weren't just numbers on a report. They were men who went home to Iowa and Boston and Philadelphia instead of dying in French mud because someone had figured out that survival didn't require better equipment. It required better thinking. The principles behind Hutchins' mirror periscope didn't fade with the end of World War I. They evolved, adapted, and reappeared in every subsequent conflict where observation required concealment. During World War II, British commandos used improvised mirror periscopes during urban reconnaissance operations in Italy and France. The devices were virtually identical to Hutchins' 1916 design. 2 mirrors, angled housing, dulled surfaces. Soviet forces besieged at Stalingrad in 1942-43 built thousands of improvised periscopes using salvaged materials from destroyed buildings. Field reports describe devices made from factory machinery mirrors and wooden beams, used to observe German positions without exposing defenders to sniper fire. Korean War, 1950-53. U.S. Marines constructed mirror observation devices during static defensive operations along the 38th parallel. The designs used pocket mirrors, ammunition crate wood, and the same 45-degree geometry Hutchins had employed 35 years earlier. Vietnam War, 1965-73. MCVSOG reconnaissance teams carried compact mirror periscopes for observing enemy trails without breaking concealment. Some units manufactured their own in-country. Others received issued versions that weighed less than 12 ounces and folded to 8 inches for transport. Gulf War, 1991. Coalition forces used fiber optic periscopes during urban operations in Kuwait City. The technology had evolved. Fiber optics instead of mirrors, electronic displays instead of direct viewing. But the underlying principle remained identical. Observation without exposure. Iraq and Afghanistan, 2003-2021, U.S. and coalition forces deployed handheld mirror devices during counterinsurgency operations. Modern versions used first surface mirrors, articulated joints, and ruggedized housings. But soldiers in forward positions still occasionally built improvised versions using the same techniques Hutchins had documented 90 years earlier. In 2003, during the Second Battle of Fallujah, Marine sniper teams used simple mirror periscopes to observe insurgent positions from behind cover in heavily contested urban sectors. The devices, 2 automotive side-view mirrors mounted on rifle cleaning rods, allowed observation around corners without exposure to enemy marksmen positioned in elevated positions. When asked by an embedded journalist why they were using primitive equipment instead of modern optical systems, one Marine sergeant gave a response that Hutchins would have understood perfectly. Because it works. Because it's fast. Because if it gets shot, I don't care. I'll just build another one. The physics of Hutchins' innovation are now taught in military engineering courses, usually without his name attached. The principle appears in field manuals, tactical doctrine, and training curriculum under various designations. Improvised observation devices, field expedient optics, combat mirror systems. But the essence remains the same. You don't need laboratories to survive. You need observation, adaptation, and the willingness to test ideas that others dismiss as impossible. In 2019, a military historian at West Point conducted a detailed analysis of observer casualty rates on the Western Front between 1915 and 1918. The study examined over 12,000 individual casualty reports across British, French, Canadian, and American units. The conclusion, published in the Journal of Military History. The introduction of simplified mirror periscopes in late 1916, spreading through informal soldier-to-soldier channels before formal military adoption, correlates with the most significant reduction in observer casualties recorded during the war. While multiple factors contributed to improved survival rates, including better trench design, tactical doctrine changes, and sniper countermeasures, the mirror periscope represents a rare example of bottom-up innovation directly measurable in casualty statistics. The study estimated that mirror periscopes, both improvised and military issue, prevented approximately 3,000 to 4,500 observer deaths across Allied forces between late 1916 and the end of the war in 1918. 3,000 to 4,000 men who lived because a farm kid from Iowa spent 4 hours in a dugout carving angle guides into a piece of pine board. William Hutchins returned to Iowa in May 1919, age 22, with a service record that mentioned nothing about mirrors or innovations. He resumed farming, married a woman named Helen Cole in 1921, raised 3 children, grew corn and soybeans on the same 240 acres where he'd learned to angle tractor mirrors. He rarely spoke about the war. When local veterans groups asked him to share stories, he declined politely. Once, in 1954, a historian from the Iowa State Historical Society tracked him down, having found his name in Lieutenant Carver's field report, now archived at the National Archives. The historian asked why Hutchins had thought to use mirrors instead of accepting the standard approach. Hutchins, age 57, sat on his porch for a long moment before answering. "I grew up looking at things indirectly," he said, checking tractor mirrors to see behind me, using reflection to signal my father across the fields. Seemed natural to keep doing it when people were trying to shoot me." The historian pressed. Didn't Hutchins feel he deserved recognition? A commendation? His name in the official records? Hutchins shook his head. Recognition doesn't matter much when you're standing in mud watching men die. What mattered was figuring out how to stop dying. The rest is just paperwork. He died in 1967, age 70, and was buried in the Cedar Valley Cemetery outside Des Moines. His obituary mentioned his service in World War I, his decades of farming, his family. It said nothing about mirrors or periscopes or the thousands of men who survived because he'd refused to accept that there was no better way. But in the trenches of the Somme, in the urban ruins of Fallujah, in the training manuals of modern armies, his idea survived. Because in war, brilliance rarely comes from laboratories. It's born in frozen mud, in desperate dugouts, in the hands of people who simply refused to die because someone told them it was impossible. Innovation under fire doesn't require genius. It requires necessity, observation, and the stubborn belief that physics doesn't care about your rank, your education, or your equipment, only whether you understand it well enough to make it work. Hutchins understood, and because he did, thousands of others lived long enough to go home, marry, have children, grow old, ordinary lives made possible by extraordinary geometry. The best ideas aren't always born in labs. Sometimes they're born in trenches, built from scrap, tested under fire, proven not by papers but by the number of men who walk away alive. That's the physics of survival. Not in textbooks, not in theories, but in the mud, the blood, and the quiet, stubborn refusal to accept that better isn't possible. If you found this story compelling, hit that like button, subscribe for more untold military engineering stories, and share this video with anyone fascinated by the ingenuity of soldiers under fire. Because the best ideas aren't always born in labs. Sometimes they're born in trenches by people who simply refuse to accept that there was no better way. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next story of wartime innovation.